Hi, Capricorn. This reading already feels incredibly deep, and honestly, it feels like someone has been carrying a lot more in their heart than they've ever let you see. There is someone here who has been doing a lot of thinking lately. Quiet thinking. The kind that happens when life slows down and there is nowhere left to run from the truth. Because what I keep picking up on is that this person is starting to see you differently. Not as a passing connection, not as someone they simply met along the way, but as someone who has quietly become important to their future. And the strange thing is, Capricorn, I don't think this realization happened all at once. It feels like something they've been resisting for a while. Maybe responsibilities got in the way. Maybe fear got in the way. Maybe they convinced themselves they had more time. But lately, something has been changing. They're beginning to understand the difference between what feels temporary and what truly matters. And honestly, I think they're starting to realize that you represent something they've been searching for much longer than they want to admit. Okay, let's take a look at what the cards want to reveal. The first thing that immediately catches my attention is the Queen of Pentacles. And honestly, Capricorn, this energy feels very important because what I'm picking up on is not someone who suddenly woke up one morning and realized they had feelings for you. No, this feels much deeper than that. This feels like someone who has been watching, observing, comparing, reflecting, and slowly coming to a realization they were not expecting. You know, sometimes people don't recognize the value of something while it's right in front of them. They become familiar with it. They assume it will always be there. They tell themselves they have time. But something about this connection feels different. Because lately, this person has started seeing you through completely different eyes. When the Queen of Pentacles appears here, I keep feeling this sense of admiration. Not just attraction, not just chemistry, admiration. They look at you and see someone who brings stability wherever they go. Someone who remains grounded even after difficult experiences. Someone who carries strength quietly. And honestly, I think that surprises them. Because the more they look at you, the more they realize how rare that energy actually is. For some of you, this person may have spent a long time chasing excitement, distractions, or situations that looked good on the surface. But those things don't seem to hold the same value anymore. Because when I look at the moon, sitting beside all of this, I feel like this person has been going through a very private emotional process. A lot of thoughts they haven't shared. A lot of feelings they haven't fully understood. And maybe that's why they stayed quiet. Maybe that's why they seemed distant at times. Because the deeper their feelings became, the harder it was to pretend they weren't there. The moon feels like late night thinking. The kind of thinking that happens when everything gets quiet. When there are no distractions left. When somebody is forced to sit alone with their own truth. And what keeps coming up is this realization that you represent something they didn't fully appreciate before. Not perfection, not fantasy. Something much more meaningful than that. You feel real to them. You feel safe. You feel consistent. You feel like someone who actually brings peace into their life rather than chaos. And honestly, I think that realization has shaken them more than they expected. Because sitting right next to this energy is the Tower. And wow, I don't feel this as destruction. I feel this as awareness. It's almost like certain beliefs they've carried for years are beginning to crack. Beliefs about relationships. Beliefs about what matters. Beliefs about what kind of future they thought they wanted. And as those walls begin to fall, they keep finding themselves thinking about you. Thinking about conversations. Thinking about memories. Thinking about the way you showed up when nobody else did. Thinking about the way you remained authentic when other people were wearing masks. There is something very humbling happening here, because this person is beginning to understand that what they once overlooked may actually be one of the most valuable things in their life. And then we have the Four of Wands. Okay, this card feels very different from the energy they carried before, because this isn't just someone wondering if they like you. This feels like someone beginning to picture what life could actually look like if you remained part of it. Not for a week, not for a month, but much further down the road. I keep seeing somebody imagining things they never allowed themselves to imagine before. Shared experiences, shared milestones, a future that feels stable rather than uncertain. And what's interesting is that I don't think they're talking about this openly. Most of this seems to be happening inside their own mind. Quietly. Almost like they're afraid to admit how much their perspective has changed. Because the more they sit with these feelings, the harder it becomes to dismiss them. And honestly, Capricorn, as these cards continue to unfold, it feels like this realization is only the beginning of a much bigger internal shift that this person is still trying to understand. Because what I'm noticing here is that the deeper these feelings become, the more careful this person seems to get. And honestly, Capricorn, that might sound strange at first. You would think that strong feelings would make someone rush forward. You would think love would make things simple. But that is not the energy I'm seeing. The moment the Emperor appears, everything becomes quieter, more controlled, more measured. This feels like someone who is trying very hard not to make a mistake. Someone who wants to move towards you, but also wants to feel prepared before they do. And I keep getting the sense that they hold themselves to incredibly high standards, higher than most people realize. You know, this might be the kind of person who appears confident on the outside, the kind of person who seems like they always know what they're doing. But underneath all of that, there is a lot they don't show. There is a lot they keep hidden, and that's where the High Priestess starts speaking. Because I don't think you're seeing everything that's happening inside this person. Not even close. There are conversations they're having with themselves that nobody else knows about. Moments where they question whether they are enough. Moments where they wonder if they can truly give you what you deserve. Moments where they imagine opening their heart completely and immediately feel vulnerable for doing so. This doesn't feel like somebody who is afraid of love itself. This feels like somebody who is afraid of failing at love. And there is a difference. Because when I look at the lovers, I don't see confusion about how they feel. Their feelings seem surprisingly clear. What feels unclear is whether they trust themselves enough to act on those feelings. Because every time they picture moving closer, another voice appears. A voice asking difficult questions. What if it doesn't work? What if they disappoint you? What if they aren't ready? What if they lose something important? What if they finally let their guard down and get hurt? And honestly, Capricorn, I think that voice has been louder than their heart for a while. The thing is, the heart hasn't gone away. If anything, it feels stronger now, which is probably why the Nine of Swords is sitting here so heavily. Because the more this person tries to ignore what they feel, the harder it becomes to find peace. I keep seeing someone lying awake longer than they should, replaying conversations, replaying memories, replaying possibilities. Not because they're obsessed with the past, but because they are trying to understand what all of this means. Trying to understand why you continue to occupy so much space in their thoughts. Why they keep comparing other experiences to the way they feel when they think about you. Why your presence continues to affect them even when you're not physically around. And honestly, I think that realization makes them nervous. Because once somebody becomes important enough to affect your decisions, your plans, your vision of the future, you can no longer pretend they don't matter. The Emperor knows that, the lovers knows that, and deep down, so do they. Which is why I keep feeling this tension between desire and caution. Part of them wants to speak. Part of them wants to reveal everything. Part of them wants to stop carrying all of these thoughts alone. But another part keeps saying, not yet. Get stronger first. Get more stable first. Figure everything out first. And the strange thing is, I'm not sure there will ever be a moment when they feel completely ready. Because some of these fears aren't coming from reality. They're coming from old disappointments, old wounds, old situations that taught them to protect themselves before anyone else could hurt them. The High Priestess keeps showing me that this person is learning something important about themselves. They're beginning to notice how often fear disguises itself as logic, how often hesitation disguises itself as caution, how often silence disguises itself as control. And little by little, those patterns are becoming harder for them to ignore, because the more honest they become with themselves, the more impossible it becomes to deny what their heart has already been trying to tell them. And when that awareness starts growing, something else begins shifting underneath the surface. Something that feels much bigger than simple attraction. Something that looks a lot like a person preparing to rebuild parts of their life from the ground up. Because once a person starts seeing their own patterns clearly, they usually arrive at a crossroads. And honestly, Capricorn, that's exactly where this energy feels like it is right now. Not a crossroads between feelings and no feelings. Not a crossroads between caring and not caring. This feels much more practical than that. It feels like somebody looking at their life and quietly asking themselves whether the version of who they are today is truly the version they want to bring into your world. The first card pulling my attention here is the Eight of Pentacles. And the moment it appeared, I got this image of someone becoming very focused, very intentional, very determined. Almost like they've entered a season where distractions don't interest them the way they used to. Because there is something they want to improve, something they want to strengthen, something they want to build. For some of you, this absolutely connects to work, career, money, long-term goals. But honestly, I don't think it's only about finances. It feels bigger than that. It feels like they are trying to become someone they can genuinely respect when they look in the mirror. Because one thing I keep hearing from this energy is, I don't want to show up halfway. And that's important. Because this person seems deeply aware of their own shortcomings right now, not in a self-pitying way, not in a victim mentality. More like someone who has finally stopped making excuses. Someone who understands that growth requires effort, and effort is exactly what they are giving. The Eight of Pentacles feels like late nights, extra hours, personal goals nobody else knows about, quiet sacrifices, small improvements that may not look dramatic from the outside, but matter tremendously to the person making them. And Capricorn, I think part of the reason they are doing this is because they have started imagining a future that requires a stronger version of themselves. The moment the King of Pentacles appears, the energy shifts again. Because this person isn't thinking about temporary solutions. They're thinking long-term. They're thinking about stability, security, consistency, the kind of life that can actually support something meaningful. And what strikes me is how serious they seem about it. Almost as though they have stopped asking themselves whether they care and started asking themselves whether they are prepared. Because those are two very different questions. One comes from emotion, the other comes from responsibility. And honestly, the second question seems to occupy their mind more than anyone realizes. You know, I keep getting the feeling that they don't want to impress you with words. They want to impress you with results. They don't want promises they can't keep. They don't want grand gestures that disappear after a few weeks. They want something real, something sustainable, something that lasts. And maybe that's why progress feels slower than they would like, because every step they take seems to come with another thing they want to improve. Another goal they want to reach. Another area of life they want to organize. The Two of Pentacles feels especially revealing here, because I don't see somebody whose life is perfectly balanced. I see somebody actively trying to create balance, trying to manage responsibilities, trying to keep multiple areas of life moving forward at once. And honestly, some days they probably feel like they're doing a great job. Other days they probably feel overwhelmed, like there is too much to carry, too many decisions, too many moving pieces. Too many things demanding their attention at the same time. But what I find interesting is that they keep going, even when things feel uncertain, even when progress feels slower than expected, because something inside them seems unwilling to give up. And when I look at the Three of Wands, I can't help but notice how often their thoughts drift toward what comes next, not from a place of fantasy, not from a place of escape, but from a place of preparation. This card feels like somebody standing quietly with a vision in their mind. A vision that is becoming clearer little by little. And what makes this so significant is that your energy seems woven into that vision. Not in an obsessive way, not in a possessive way. More like somebody realizing that certain dreams no longer feel complete without a particular person standing beside them. Okay, that realization seems to be creating another shift beneath the surface. Because the more they work on themselves, the more difficult it becomes to ignore some truths that have been waiting patiently for their attention. All along, some realizations don't arrive gently. They arrive when a person can no longer look away from themselves. And honestly, Capricorn, that is exactly what this energy feels like. There's a moment here where everything becomes impossible to ignore. Not because somebody forces them to face the truth, not because circumstances suddenly become dramatic, but because something inside them has become louder than all the distractions they once used to avoid it. The first card I see stepping forward is Judgment. And wow, this feels incredibly personal, almost like someone standing alone with their memories, looking back over choices they made years ago, months ago, maybe even recently, and seeing them through completely different eyes. I keep feeling this wave of awareness washing over them, the kind of awareness that makes a person stop mid-thought and think, why did I do that? Why was I so afraid? Why did I keep running from things that actually mattered? And the interesting thing is that nobody else may even know this process is happening. From the outside, they could appear exactly the same, going to work, handling responsibilities, living their life. But internally, something significant is shifting, because Judgment feels like somebody waking up, not to a new person, not to a new relationship, but to themselves, to patterns they repeated, to fears they justified, to walls they convinced themselves were necessary. And the more honest they become, the harder it is to keep carrying those old versions of themselves. That's where death enters this reading. And honestly, this card feels surprisingly peaceful. Not easy, but peaceful. Because I'm not seeing resistance anymore. I'm seeing surrender. I'm seeing someone finally admitting that certain parts of their life have reached their expiration date. Old beliefs, Old fears, old stories they've been telling themselves. Stories about why they couldn't move forward. Stories about why they needed to stay guarded. Stories about why vulnerability was dangerous. Those stories don't seem to fit anymore. You know, there comes a point when holding on to an old identity becomes more painful than letting it go. And I think they're approaching that point. Because every time they try to return to old habits, something feels off. Every time they try to convince themselves they don't care as much as they do, something inside pushes back. Every time they attempt to avoid what they're feeling, they end up right back where they started. Thinking, reflecting, questioning, growing. The tower appears again, but this feels different from before. Much quieter, much deeper. Almost like the first crack has already happened. And what remains is the rebuilding. Because the tower here feels like somebody recognizing that certain foundations in their life were never as solid as they thought. Maybe they built decisions around fear. Maybe they built plans around security instead of happiness. Maybe they spent years focusing on what looked right rather than what felt right. And honestly, that realization can be unsettling, especially for someone who likes certainty, especially for someone who prefers structure. Because once a person sees the truth, they can't unsee it, which brings me to the Ace of Swords. In Capricorn, this card feels like a breath of fresh air after a very long season of confusion. Not because every answer suddenly appears, not because every problem disappears, but because clarity starts replacing avoidance. I keep seeing somebody having honest conversations with themselves, conversations they've postponed for far too long, conversations that begin with uncomfortable questions and slowly lead toward liberating answers. And what's fascinating is that these answers don't seem to be coming from other people. They're coming from within. They're discovering things about themselves that nobody could have taught them. Lessons that had to be lived. Lessons that had to be earned. Lessons that'll reveal themselves after enough mistakes have been made. Okay. And the more clarity they gain, the less interested they become in pretending. Pretending they're unaffected. Pretending they don't care. Pretending they can continue living exactly the way they have been. Because something about this awakening feels irreversible. Like a door that has already opened. Like a truth that has already been spoken somewhere deep inside their soul. And as this transformation continues unfolding, another energy begins emerging from the distance. An energy that feels far less focused on what was lost and far more focused on what might still be rebuilt. A strange sense of determination begins showing up here. Not the kind that comes from pride. Not the kind that comes from wanting to prove a point. This feels much more sincere than that. It feels like somebody reaching a place where avoiding the situation no longer feels easier than addressing. And honestly, Capricorn, that shift matters, because for a long time, I think this person believed they could simply move forward without looking back. Keep busy, keep distracted, keep telling themselves that enough time would eventually make everything disappear. But the energy surrounding the Three of Pentacles tells a different story. I keep seeing someone looking at what was left unfinished, not with regret alone, not with guilt alone, but with a genuine desire to understand what could have been done differently, what could have been handled better, what could still be repaired. Because the truth is, growth changes the way a person sees the past. Situations that once seemed justified start looking different. Conversations they avoided start feeling important. Opportunities they overlooked begin carrying new meaning. And the more self-awareness they've gained, the more difficult it becomes to ignore the role they played in creating certain distances. You know, I don't feel like this person is interested in pretending nothing happened. That's not what this energy feels like. If anything, they seem increasingly aware that real healing requires honesty, that rebuilding requires accountability, and that meaningful connections can't survive on avoidance forever. The Three of Pentacles feels very intentional, almost like somebody quietly asking themselves, if I had another chance, what would I do differently? And Capricorn, the answer keeps leading them back toward effort, toward communication, toward showing up differently than they did before. The Six of Swords feels especially emotional here, not dramatic, not chaotic, just deeply emotional. Because I keep getting this image of somebody slowly releasing old burdens, not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to realize they don't want to keep carrying them forever. Old resentments, old fears, old disappointments, even old versions of themselves. They're beginning to understand that some things cannot come with them into the future. And honestly, that realization seems to be creating space inside them. Space that was previously occupied by fear. Space that was previously occupied by hesitation. Space that is gradually being filled with something softer, something more hopeful. That's where the Ace of Cups begins speaking. And wow, This energy feels surprisingly vulnerable because beneath all the reflection, all the growth, all the rebuilding, there is still a heart here. A heart that never completely stopped feeling. A heart that may have tried to stay guarded. A heart that may have hidden behind responsibilities, logic, or self-protection. But a heart nonetheless. And I keep sensing moments where this person catches themselves thinking about you unexpectedly. A song, a place, a memory, a random moment during an ordinary day. And suddenly they're reminded of how much emotion still exists underneath everything else. Not because they're trying to force those feelings, but because the feelings are simply there, waiting, patiently. The Ace of Cups feels like emotional honesty beginning to outweigh emotional fear. It feels like somebody becoming less interested in protecting themselves from disappointment and more interested in understanding what their heart actually wants. Okay, and that's where things start getting interesting, because the Knight of Swords doesn't feel quiet at all. After so much reflection, so much observation, so much internal work, there's a growing restlessness attached to this card. Almost like somebody realizing they can't think their way through everything forever. At some point, decisions have to become actions. At some point, clarity has to become communication. At some point, intentions have to leave the safety of the mind and enter the real world. And honestly, Capricorn, I think that realization is starting to build pressure, not negative pressure. The kind of pressure that happens when somebody has something important they need to say. Something they've rehearsed 100 times in their head. Something they've imagined countless ways. Because the Knight of Swords feels like words gathering momentum. Truth gathering momentum. Courage gathering momentum. And while I don't feel this person has every answer yet, I do feel them becoming increasingly aware that staying silent forever is no longer an option that feels comfortable. Because every step of growth they've taken has been leading them toward one unavoidable realization. The connection they once tried to keep at a distance is becoming impossible to view as something temporary. And that awareness seems to be opening the door to a vision of the future that looks very different from the one they were living inside before. What feels different here is the level of seriousness attached to these cards. Because this no longer feels like somebody asking themselves whether a connection matters. It feels like somebody asking themselves what kind of future they actually want to build. And honestly, Capricorn, those are very different questions. The energy shifts the moment the Ten of Cups appears, not because it feels dreamy or unrealistic. Actually, it feels surprisingly grounded. Almost like this person has stopped chasing temporary satisfaction and started paying attention to what creates genuine fulfillment. I keep seeing somebody reevaluating their priorities, not in a dramatic way, more like a gradual awakening. The kind that happens after enough experiences teach you what doesn't work. After enough disappointments reveal what isn't worth holding on to. After enough time passes that you finally understand what brings peace and what only creates noise. And for some reason, whenever I sit with this energy, your presence keeps appearing in the background. Not because they're idealizing you, not because they believe everything would be perfect, but because when they picture a meaningful future, you naturally appear inside that vision. You know, sometimes a person spends years searching for excitement and eventually discovers they were looking for stability all along. Sometimes they chase freedom only to realize what they really wanted was connection. And honestly, that's what this feels like. A person slowly recognizing that maturity changes what they value. The Four of Wands appears again, but the feeling surrounding it has evolved. Before, it felt like possibility. Now it feels like intention. Because this person seems to be imagining something much more tangible. Shared experiences, shared goals, shared milestones. Not the fantasy version of a relationship, the real version. The version that requires effort, communication, patience, trust. The version that survives ordinary days as well as extraordinary ones. And what fascinates me is how naturally their thoughts seem to move in this direction now. There was a time when they might have avoided these kinds of thoughts altogether. A time when commitment felt intimidating. A time when responsibility felt heavy. But something has changed. The resistance isn't as strong as it once was. The fear isn't controlling the conversation the way it used to. Because experience has taught them something important. Running away from meaningful connections doesn't create freedom. It only creates distance. The World card feels incredibly powerful here, not because it feels like an ending. Actually, it feels like completion, like someone finally understanding a lesson they spent years trying to learn. And honestly, I think part of that lesson involved understanding themselves, understanding what they truly need, understanding what they genuinely value, understanding what kind of person they want to become. The World feels like somebody stepping back and seeing the larger picture for the first time. All the mistakes, all the delays, all the confusion, all the growth. It's almost like they can finally see how every experience has led them toward a deeper understanding of what matters. And that understanding seems to be influencing every decision they make moving forward. Because standing beside all of this is the King of Pentacles. And wow, this energy feels incredibly mature, very steady, very intentional. There is nothing rushed about it, nothing impulsive, nothing reckless. The King of Pentacles feels like somebody who has stopped asking, "What do I want today?" and started asking, "What can I build that will still matter years from now?" That question seems to be guiding them lately, in their work, in their personal growth, in their relationships, and perhaps most importantly, in the way they think about you. Because I don't feel this person is looking for something temporary anymore. I don't feel them searching for excitement just for the sake of excitement. What I feel is somebody becoming increasingly aware that the things worth having often require consistency, presence, commitment, the very qualities they are trying to cultivate within themselves. Okay, and there's something else here. Something they may not be fully admitting yet. Because the more clearly they see the future, the more obvious it becomes that certain decisions can no longer remain undecided forever. Certain conversations can no longer remain unspoken forever. Certain feelings can no longer remain hidden forever. I keep seeing someone standing on the edge of an important choice. Not a choice driven by fear, not a choice driven by pressure, a choice driven by clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives after a long season of growth. And as that clarity continues strengthening, it feels like this person is getting closer and closer to answering a question they've been carrying inside themselves for a very long time. And maybe that's the most important thing this reading wanted to show us today. Not just where this person has been, but who they're slowly becoming. Because sometimes the biggest shifts happen quietly, away from the spotlight, away from other people's expectations. One small choice at a time, one honest realization at a time. And whether this story resonates with your situation or not, I hope it reminds you of something. Real growth has a way of changing everything it touches, including the way we love. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, Capricorn. I truly appreciate your energy, your presence, and the space we've shared here today. Take good care of yourself, keep trusting your own journey, and I'll see you again very soon in another reading. Bye for now.